Hi. Okay, let's talk about the section called the Analytical Writing Assessment on the GMAT. When GMAT changed its format and introduced the integrated reasoning section, replacing the analysis of an issue task, many people who loathed writing were happy. In the 3 years since then, most of these have become nostalgic because if analysis of an issue was difficult, many test takers would tell you integrated reasoning comes with its own set of challenges. Anyway, the analysis of an argument task on GMAT is considered easier because the GMAT focuses extensively on critical reasoning, but that is not the only reason. The fact is, even the task prompts are easier. What is a task prompt, you might ask? The answer is, if you look at the task prompts, that is, the directions after an argument, in the GRE analysis of an argument task, you might see that the directions change. Some arguments ask for how well reasoned the argument is. Some arguments ask for the unstated and stated assumptions, and the remaining ask for what information would you need to evaluate the given recommendation. Now, in essence, these three are linked, which is why I have discussed them in another video called Approaching the AWA on the GRE. But at least for the GMAT, the presentation of the write-up will change because the instructions are pretty homogeneous. And as I said, all these three expectations, be it the assumptions, be it further information, be it flaw in the reasoning, all of these are linked. Look at it this way. You have studied critical reasoning. You can differentiate, therefore, a strong argument from a weak argument. A weak argument is an argument with some or the other logical flaw or some information that is missing. So then your starting point clearly is to identify the flaw in the given argument, because from the flaw that you identify, you can derive the assumptions. So let's take an argument wherein you observe that the argument is flawed because it generalizes from a sample. Now, flawed generalization is the case where a conclusion is drawn upon the entire population based on a certain observation or some observations. And the argument does not clearly state whether the sample is representative enough for the conclusion to be extrapolated. That precisely is the missing information. And so, when you say that the argument is flawed because of flawed generalization, you can also simply state that the argument assumes that the sample is representative or comparable, and therefore, the conclusion of the sample can be drawn to apply to the entire population. Now, many of you might have observed that an assumption, if accepted as a fact, strengthens the argument. The opposite or the negation of this statement obviously weakens the argument. And finally, if the validity of the argument relies completely on whether the sample is representative, that pretty much answers your question on what further information do you need to evaluate the argument. So before you start typing, identify the flaws of the argument. Then read the instructions, because these same flaws will give you the unstated assumptions and what questions need to be answered to evaluate the argument. And finally, remember the three axioms of analytical writing assessment. First, do not obsess over number of words. Yes, there is always an expected length, but that is not more than 300 to 350 words. That does not mean if you write less than 300, it will hamper your score. That also does not mean you cannot write beyond 350. But then do not try to compromise your quality through quantity. A long but badly worded analytical writing write-up, one which has a lot of spelling and grammar errors, won't get you a good score just because you assume that the evaluator might give you a benefit of doubt that you made so many errors because you wrote so much. Wrong. Second, never try to find too many flaws. 2 to 3 flaws and relevant assumptions should be fine. Going for too many flaws might leave you in a catch-22 situation where you are unsure whether to write about all of them or choose from them. So instead of deciding how many is too much, an easier parameter is your thinking when you are trying to identify what are the flaws in the argument. When you are trying to identify what are the assumptions of the argument, try to restrict that time to 2 to 3 minutes. Do not go beyond 2 to 3 minutes. Whatever comes into your mind in these 2 to 3 minutes should be sufficient to elaborate upon through your explanation in the next 15 to 20 minutes, which brings you to the third and the most critical axiom of AWA. Do not forget to proofread at the end, because the AWA is a very basic word processing machine, and therefore all the mistakes that you make, you'll have to correct them yourself. And remember, this is the GMAT. You've already learned sentence correction. You know correct English usage. You've learned critical reasoning. You know how to present a flaw or an assumption. Being correct in spelling and grammar is crucial because someday you'll be a manager and you will communicate with those above you and those below you. Google gives you the option in its Google Mail of unsending the mail you just sent, and trust me, that has actually saved many jobs which might otherwise have been lost because of a badly worded mail or a mail that ends up creating a confusing meaning. GMAT too, just like Google, allows you enough time to type out 300 to 400 words and correct all of it so that you present something that reflects both your thinking skills and your writing skills. Enjoy your AWA.